And I see we've got some students already coming on here. So while we have students coming on, we just want to thank you for joining us today. We are joined by Professor Deanne Westerman in our psychology department. She's going to be talking about our autobiographical memories. We've got a pretty exciting talk and just an overview about the psychology department, what that looks like at Binghamton, maybe some of the research opportunities we have here. During the talk, you can feel free to use the Q&A function at any time. That will allow you to ask questions, and we do have one of our admissions counselors on the back end to answer some of those questions. But any of the questions specifically about the talk or about psychology at Binghamton in general, we will wait until the end, and we'll have Deanne address some of those questions after the talk. We will be using the polls feature throughout the talk as well, so interact with our students here a little bit. So feel free to utilize those when they come up. And if you have any other questions throughout the way, as I mentioned, you can use the question and answer box. We will also be sending you maybe some various links or Deanne's information towards the end of the presentation in that chat box as well. So just kind of keep an eye on those. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deanne, and she'll start introducing a little bit about the psychology department and what that looks like at Binghamton before going into the talk. So thank you so much, Deanne, for joining us.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I wish that we could be here in person. I wish I could meet you in person. I know we were scheduled to have a admitted students open house around this time that I was going to attend, and I usually get to meet some of the prospective students. So, but hopefully I'll be able to give you enough information to help you make your decision. So first, congratulations on being admitted to Binghamton, and I'm so happy to represent the psychology department. I think we have a fantastic department. I absolutely love it here. And I think most of our students are actually really happy with the major and very happy here. So let me tell you about it. I'll go ahead and you can move to the next slide. And Carrie, go ahead and move to this next slide. Thank you. So we have two majors that are within psychology. So psychology is the study of human behavior. It is an empirical science. So what that means is an empirical science means that it's based on observations, not just based on theory, you know. So we really do focus on research. Every faculty member has an active research lab that includes undergraduate research assistants. So I can't think of anybody that doesn't have undergraduate students involved in their research. Often you can work in a lab for more, 2 years or so after you get sort of the fundamental courses down, and then you often can join a lab. And so we do emphasize research, and we emphasize research training for our students, both undergrad and graduate students. And so we have two majors, psychology and integrative neuroscience. And so they were both concerned with explaining, kind of describing and explaining and predicting human behavior, but the level of analysis is a bit different. So the integrative neuroscience major is interested in biological bases of behavior and how the brain controls behavior and the brain areas, brain systems, and the brain mechanisms responsible for that. Whereas the psychology major is also still interested in human behavior. And however, it emphasizes more the cognitive, emotional, and social factors that underlie behavior. And within the psychology major, if you wanted to, you would also have the opportunity to do a track in what is called autism spectrum disorders. That is up until truly a month ago, it was called Applied Behavior Analysis. It's sort of a long story. We had to change the name due to New York State licensing requirements, but it is a school and an institute for children with autism and their families. It's a real resource for their families. And we have undergraduate students that get specialized training in that and work there and do research and are involved in the programming there. So I have a few photos here, and mostly those are to remind me. So we have, faculty kind of spread across campus, but this is one of our main hubs, and right through those front doors on the top photo, right through the top of the front doors is our advising office. We have a really thriving big advising office run by Dr. Barbara Luca. We also have peer advisors, and we have graduate students that help people, find their way through the major, find their path through the major to graduation. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide, which is as soon as you walk in the door, you see the faculty directory. And I know you can't really see these faces, and this was taken right after it was installed, so not everybody's face is up there. But I have it here to give you a sense of the size of the faculty and the staff. Some of them are staff. And to remind me, you probably can't see these people, but I know who all of them are. So it's just to remind me to tell you about some of the different research areas that we have. So we have people doing research in clinical psychology. So those the subjects that they study are things like anxiety disorders. We have a specialized clinic in obsessive compulsive disorders. We have mood disorders such as depression. We have people that study the effect of trauma on relationships. And we have another group of people studying relationships and the factors that sort of predict relationship health and discord and things like that. We have clinical faculty studying schizophrenia and personality disorders. We have a group of faculty that are it's kind of a cluster within our faculty. We call it behavioral neuroscience. And so, and they study myriad topics. We have a pretty large group studying alcohol abuse and from a biological, kind of the biological bases of that. We also have faculty studying Parkinson's disease, sex and reproductive behaviors. Within our cognitive and brain sciences area, that's the area that I'm in. We have people studying memory, that's my area, language, categorization, concepts and categories, as well as developmental cognitive development. So we have a pretty wide range of research topics. And if you go to our website, at the very first page, we had our website up there, and you can read about the faculty's interests. And I always tell people, after they've been here for a little while, after a couple of years, and they've had a couple of the basic courses, to read and get to know the faculty's research and see what seems most interesting, and then approach the faculty members. Sometimes there's a standard application process, and sometimes you just have to kind of take the initiative and contact them and learn about the research and see how you can be involved. So I'm going to just launch now into my pet research topic and my pet interests and what I study. And then, at the end, I know it's a big decision to where you're going to go to school and what you're going to major in. So I'm sure you'll have questions about that. And so I'm happy to answer anything I can. So, in thinking about today's talk, I study a lot of different areas of human memory, and I actually study memory illusions and false memories. But I thought, this is such an interesting time. It's a bit of a curse, that old curse, may you live in interesting times. We're in a really interesting time right now. And I have been wondering how we're all going to remember this later. And it made me think that I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we do remember the stories of our lives. What parts of our whole life story are we going to remember best, and what parts do we remember worse? And so when we think back to other parts of our lives, memory researchers use the phrase mental time travel. And mental time travel, you can see here in this photo, I don't know if you recognize it, but it's from the Titanic. And it's Rose, one of the main characters, played by Kate Winslet when she's younger, is remembering the story of the sinking of the Titanic. And she says, it's been 84 years. And the next sentence is, and I can still smell the fresh paint on the boat. And so she's describing what we mean by mental time travel, that you can visit, in a way, past periods of your life. Now, we know that many of those memories that we have are not perfectly accurate. We know that we reconstruct them. We know that they are fallible. However, and the way that we remember them and the things that we remember best follow pretty logical principles. So if you're in high school right now, taking a lot of different subjects, you are already expert memorizers. It often doesn't feel like that when you're in school and you're having to study so much and you wish you could learn things faster. But trust me, you are good memorizers, and you probably already have a sense that the way that you remember things best is to first pay attention to it. So the things we remember from our lives are things that we pay attention to. They're the things that what we call rehearse, which means we think about over and over again, we tell other people. There are things that stand out from the background, so distinctive events, things that are surprising are remembered. They get more attention, they get a little bit more thought and rehearsal, and they're remembered better. And things that are emotional, particularly things that are surprising and emotional, tend to be remembered well. But that's actually not what I'm going to focus on today. What I'm going to focus on is how we remember things from different time periods. So I'm going to have Carrie advance the next slide. And at the same time, I'm going to ask you to think about your life story, and in particular, where your life story begins. So we have a poll question for you, and I want you to think back to your the first memory that you can remember, what you think is your earliest memory, and think about how old you were when that event took place. Sometimes it's just a little fragment. It doesn't have to be a complete event. You know, you might just remember standing in a house somewhere or something. And if you just kind of, I have limited options there, but if you tell me when you think that is. Okay, do we have any results? Okay, interesting. Okay, well, I would tell you that typically, okay, this is very interesting. The highest response rate is 2 years old. And I will say that that would be quite young. Generally speaking, most people don't have any memories from really before the age of 3, even when there are really dramatic events. And so sometimes it can be very hard to figure out when something occurred. You sort of like, I think I was about 2, I think I was, you know, it's hard to date them because you might have these fragmented memories. So for the most part, Carrie, if you can move the screen, I'll tell you about the research that we have on that period of life. Most people feel, and then you can move to the next one. Most people feel like their life story begins around the age of 3. So I made you kind of forced you into 2, 3, 4, 5. The research that we have on this suggests that, at least in terms of having an accurate memory, that usually starts around the age of 3 or 4 for most people. And that even events that are quite dramatic, you know, hospitalizations, major surgeries, you know, a parent, if, you know, like the death of a parent, for example, really dramatic stuff that can happen. If it happens before the age of 3, typically you don't have very many memories. Maybe right if you're at the cusp of 2 and 3. This is a well-known study where they looked at kind of these lost years. We call it infantile amnesia. Those are the years before 3, and those years are generally lost. And they just asked people, college students, what do you remember about the birth of your younger sibling? And they sort of plotted it as a function across the bottom axis there, the x-axis. It's the college student's age that they were when their next youngest sibling was born. And so, and this is just a sense of accuracy. So you see that line, when the students were 1 years old to 2.9 years old, they got basically nothing correct about the questions surrounding the birth of their sibling, which is a pretty dramatic event for a child to have a new family member come in. It tends to be well remembered if it's beyond the age of 3. After that, then you see memory just sort of shoots up, and that's kind of when our life story generally comes online. But often you just have these kind of fragmented memories. You might have one memory from the age of 3, and then boom, you're 5. It's not like everything comes online at once. But I would say, I'm just going to make a blanket statement that says the time period of our life that we remember worse is that very early childhood period. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. We are not exactly sure. There are many different mechanisms that might be responsible for this period of what we call childhood or infantile amnesia, but the first thing you should know is it's not as though children cannot form long-lasting memories. They certainly can. If you've spent any time around a kid, you know they remember things from day to day. They have favorite toys, they know where they're stored and things like that. But it is as though those memories are gradually lost, you know, and it's not right away. It's maybe around the age of 6, 7, they start to get lost. And then an 8-year-old usually won't remember that stuff from the age of 3 and younger. And by the time that they are an adult, that they have really lost access to those memories. Okay, you can move to the next slide. I will just give you a brief sketch of why we think it happens. And there are different possibilities. It's hard to really study experimentally, but they do some animal models on this. And we know that this is not something that's unique to humans. Any sort of what we call an altricial mammal. So this is a mammal that has a nervous system that is not fully developed at the time of birth, but it goes through a maturation process. So that would be monkeys, humans, rats, coyotes, bears. They all would experience that period of infantile amnesia, it seems. Whereas, here's a fun fact, guinea pigs are called precocial animals, and they are actually born with a fully intact nervous system, and they don't go through a period of forgetting, you know, not like the guinea pigs I've known haven't had super exciting lives, but they do remember that early period. If you would teach them something, if you would teach them to avoid a particular area of their cage or something, they would retain that throughout their lifespan, whereas rats, for example, would have lost that information about early learning. People have also noted that there are a lot of language changes that happen around the same time, and also how we develop a self-concept happens around the same time, and possibly those factors contribute to that picture. So if you want to know more about that, we teach, you know, several courses that would cover that. So you can move to the next slide. And so the next thing I want to talk about is what time periods we remember best. So this is a little bit more positive. So what are we going to remember the best from our lives? And so again, this is not specific memories. It's just there are certain things that happen, even mundane things, that people tend to remember well just based on when they happen to us in our life story. So we have a poll and coming up, and I just want you to think of an event, a personal event that is associated with the word lamp. Any kind of memory associated with that from any point in your life. And just answer, how long ago do you think that took place? Was that within the last year, or was that more than a year ago? So was that really recently or a bit later? So I will say, as you're thinking about this, probably because I started this little mini lecture talking about early childhood memories, that is going to encourage you, sort of primes people to think about their early childhood memories. So this is not a fantastic demonstration, but so 45% of you came up with something in the last year, and the rest said more than a year ago. All right, so I suspect that if I had not started by making you think about your earliest period of life, and if you just try this next time you're talking to some adults in your life, for example, ask them this question, and and it wouldn't just be one word. So this research, Carrie, if you move to the next slide. So this research would actually include many words. So you can do this work on the internet, and you can get thousands of people to participate in these studies. Everybody loves to tell stories about their lives. So you would just give them these kind of neutral words and ask them to identify an event that word reminds them of. And then you ask them, when did that occur? How old were you when that occurred? And that is a technique that's been used to collect, I mean, absolutely, probably over the years, 20,000 data points, and probably more than that. And so what is interesting about that is how people answer that depends on how old they are. So if you move to the next slide, Carrie, I can show you. So generally speaking, people about your age, so you're probably, I don't know how old everybody in the audience is, but let's say, you know, you're of traditional age, we're starting college near near the time that you finished high school, so 16 to 18 or so. And so this would be the bar closest to your age range here. And the blue line, and what this is just measuring is the proportion of memories that sort of fall within that time period. And all that graph is telling you is that for young people, they tend to come up with a personal event that was pretty recent in their lives, within the last, couple of years or so. And so that's kind of boring. It gets a little bit more interesting if you look at how that changes as you age. So Carrie, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide is a group of people that are ages 26 to 45. And so each of those lines represents a different age cohort. And if you look at the very far right one, that is the oldest group of people. So that's 41 to 45. And about the age of 40, you start to see this interesting pattern emerge. And it's this little bump that is kind of in this graph centered around the age of 10. And Carrie, if you show me the next slide, okay, it gets really dramatic. It starts to get really dramatic as people age. And particularly if you look at the oldest age group, which is this dark blue bar, 71 to 78. Those are our oldest participants in this study. And what you see is this so the recency portion, so they're not tending as strongly to recount memories from the last year or 2 years. Instead, they gravitate towards this earlier period of their lives. And it's roughly, ages 10 to 30. And it's interesting because they have so many decades to choose from, and they never pick things from when they're 40. I mean, almost never pick things from when they're 40 or 50 or 60. It's all the things. It's sort of like, we talk about mental time travel. It's almost like there's an express stop as you age that goes right back to that period of time. And that's the kind of the period of time that most of you are in now. So you are not yet aware of it. But as you get older, you will shift, and it starts to happen around the age of 40, where the things that cue your memory and the triggers you have, you will suddenly start to find yourself thinking, why am I thinking about that old memory, and that happens to almost everybody. Carrie, you can move to the next slide. It is something that's called the reminiscence bump in memory. And it is, the next slide has a set, it just shows that this is not just American or North American sample. You might say, well, this is a really critically important time period among American people. Well, no, this has actually been found in every culture. It's been tested. Although the exact peak of that curve kind of moves a little bit, you still see that this is the same shape. Now, in this particular study, they actually directed people, please don't give me an answer from the last year. And that was just to get rid of that recency portion, because they wanted to just see where this bump was occurring and whether it would occur. So these are 5 different countries with cultural, distinct cultures, and you still find this bump. So it's, so this is again called the reminiscence bump. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. Here's some good news. You do travel back to that time, but those memories tend to be positive. So that bump, if you just sort out after you ask people, okay, that story you just told me about the lamp and the taxi and the horse, was that a positive memory, a negative memory, or a neutral memory? And to somebody reading some of those stories, often you wouldn't be able to, on face value, know whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. A lot of them sound neutral, but the rememberer tends to rate it very positively. It's a positive feeling and produces a positive feeling. So this is, I don't know whether you are aware of the song, the Bruce Springsteen song, Glory Days. It's a great song from my glory days in the 80s. And so it's just simply, that song is about the fact that people tend to, as they become middle-aged, start to think back to the most positive things that kind of happened to them, and they relive their glory days. So you really are only seeing the memories that are retrieved, even if they seem kind of neutral, at the time, they tend to be rated as positively later. And in fact, we learned that there's been some interesting research on nostalgia, which is kind of thinking back wistfully about the past. And we know that it can elevate people's mood, just having them reminisce and having them even just think about the past and their younger days actually really elevates their mood. So so it seems to perform some emotional regulation function. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. Just like infantile amnesia, we don't have a great explanation. If you take my memory class, we could go through one of these one by one. But, you know, people have noted that it is also around the time of peak mental acuity where you are able to form memories very quickly and very rapidly. I actually, at the beginning, I started by pointing out that you're all expert memorizers right now, and that actually is true. You learn things more rapidly now than people of other ages. You're kind of in your peak cognitively. People have also noted that there are a lot of firsts. So I mentioned the role of distinctiveness, things that stand out from the background. So, you know, you get your first car, your first job, your first relationships, your first disappointments, your first rejections. A lot of those firsts are distinctive, and that makes them more memorable. And people have also noted that this is kind of where an important aspects that we consider that are important across a lot of cultures start to kind of develop. There's a lot of important things around that time that involve just your life narrative, and that's kind of when they're happening. So if you come here and you take my human memory course, we'll talk about each of these a little bit more and we do more reading on it. So you can move to the next slide. So I just wanted to tell you one caveat. So the reminiscence bump is the fact that we tend to remember stuff. I would just say it's kind of like the second decade of life. So 10 to mid-20s are remembered really well. There's one difference, and that would be odor memories. So what we call olfactory memories. So these would be memories that are triggered by an odor. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you walk into a door, a strange place, and you're just kind of, you smell something and it just sends you back. And indeed, odor memories are really associated with a very strong feeling of mentally re-experiencing event, the mental time travel. And when people travel back, they travel to that first decade of life. So when they, unlike word cues or just maybe giving people a picture as a cue, when it's an odor cue, and you can study this in the lab by giving people, you know, like a jar that has coffee beans in the bottom, and then you can't see what's in it. So it might be coffee or orange juice or, you know, bleach or something like that, things that have a distinctive smell. And you say, what does this remind you of? They will travel back to that first decade of life. So, and if you think the first decade of life, you can't really remember that well before the age of 3 or 4. So you're really just talking about a very narrow window, about the ages 5 to, you know, 10 or something like that. And so olfactory memories tend to be what we call older, and they can be very powerful cues to memory. And we think that that has to do with where they're processed in the brain. It's close to in a very emotional center of the brain, very old center of the brain called the limbic system. So you can move to the next slide. And so just to sum up, what parts of your life story will you remember? Well, you know, part of it will depend on what happens to you, you know, how, and you'll remember there are things that are definitely more memorable than other things. However, even boring things are actually more memorable when they happen to you from the ages of 16 to say 25. So assuming that's kind of, I just sort of picked that because I assume that most of the people who are listening in are in that age range. So it's the stuff that's happening right now. And right now is not the funnest time for any of us. And I don't know where you're tuning in from. And I know that I hope you're doing well. And I know this is a really trying time. And especially if you've been directly affected by the current events with COVID-19. But it's not a great time. However, that said, the research has shown that even things that are kind of neutral or even somewhat negative actually are later viewed more positively. And the things that you tend to remember and the things that you tend to retrieve, you can remember the bad stuff, but your mind doesn't go there as often. The things that you will voluntarily retrieve with the cue tend to be the positive stuff. So that's the end of my my little mini lecture here, and we'll just open it up to any questions that you have about any part of this. So.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I know that was quite enlightening for me. I'm sure our students enjoyed it as well. So any students in the audience, you can feel free to ask us questions either related to this topic or related to psychology in general. There is a question to start us off. So what inspired you to study memory, and how did you get into your field of research?
Oh, this is like my favorite topic. And in fact, it was so hard to pare this down to 10 minutes, 10, or I probably went over. I just love to talk about the subject. Well, I'll say when I started as a psych major, I didn't come into college as a psych major. I started as an economics major. I really had no clue what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked to look at graphs, and I like to think about the information that was in graphical form. And I just thought, okay, economics, that seems like that involves a lot of graphs. Just not a super smart way to pick your major. Probably I had taken a high school class on psychology, and it all involved Sigmund Freud, and I thought that I thought it was ridiculous, and I thought, if there's one major I'm not going to have, it's going to be psychology. And then I learned, I took my introductory to psychology course, and that's where I learned about psychology experiments. And then I must have learned along the way that there was a field of memory. And I think I've just always been very interested in memory. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but I've just been, I've always known I've had a good memory, kind of almost embarrassingly so, where I remember people and they don't remember meeting me, and then I have to pretend like I don't remember them. And so that's been kind of the story of my life a little bit. So maybe, in psychology, we sometimes joke that you're doing me search instead of research, because you pick your pet. Because if you can study human behavior, you often will pick your pet interests that correspond to your abilities and your interests and things like that. So I've always found it fascinating how you can relive things from the past, and I've wanted to know more about that. And I had no idea that there were people in the world that got paid to do that. And when I figured that out, that's what I set my the compass to make that happen. So I still can't believe it. It's so lucky. So
Great, thank you. So kind of leading from that, you kind of talked about how you found your career path, but how are students at Binghamton finding their specialties in other paths? We have a question about research in forensic psychology, or if there are any classes about that. So just specialties in general, how does a student find their specialty at Binghamton? And then, how do they get into that?
Yeah, it's very difficult to do it just by sitting and thinking about what your interests are, and I remember just feeling some pressure to figure it out, and you're never going to, in my opinion, figure it out that way. You have to just go and be exposed to it, and to be kind of aware of what excites you, like what you most enjoy reading about, what do you most enjoy thinking about. And so I would just tell you not to overthink it, especially at the beginning. Just aim to learn as much as you can about, kind of, and pay attention as you're learning. Like, what do you find really interesting? I got into economics, and my first couple of classes, it was so boring to me. And thank goodness I didn't, I found something really interesting that interested me. So I think just paying attention, exposing yourself to things, and then paying attention to your reaction is the way you're going to find your career path. At the same time, you also have to think, instead of what subject do I want to do, you have to ask yourself, how do I want to spend my days? When picture yourself 20 years in the future, which is difficult, but picture yourself far in the future. How do you want to spend your days? Do you want to spend it around other people? Do you want to spend it helping people on the front lines? Would you rather have your own little projects and work at a more of an administrative capacity? So kind of learning about yourself, which is an ongoing process. And I don't know each of you, but I would bet you're in the infancy of learning about yourself and what you're interested in and how you want to spend your days and what kind of work you want to do. So I would lay off of the pressure of that and just go and experience some stuff. And I've always thought it's like falling in love. Like, you can't force it, right? You just go and live your life, and you pay attention, and things will interest you more than other things. And you're at a wonderful period of your time where you can just sample some things, and you you don't have to feel a lot of pressure. There was a question about forensic psychology. So we actually just hired somebody in this who wonderful. Her name is Dr. Brittany Race, and she does work on eyewitness memory and eyewitness testimony. And she's a social psychologist, but she studies kind of what we call basically the variables that impact, say, eyewitness memory for crimes, and also jury decisions and things like that. So we do have somebody brand new, and she is just getting her lab up and running, and doing really cool stuff. She does a lot of expert witness. But forensic psychology is it can mean a lot of things. And so we actually also teach a course on forensic psychology that has a little bit more to do with like assessment, to figure out if somebody is kind of competent for trial and that kind of thing. So forensic psychology is very broad, but we do teach a course on it, and we have other, like I mentioned, the cognitive classes that end up being relevant to that. So I'm happy to, if you have any additional questions, and you can email me and I can send you the links to those course descriptions and things like that.
Great, thank you. And you also mentioned, I think this is a great segue, you mentioned picturing yourself, what do you want to do, in 20 years with this degree? So one of the questions is, what are some common career paths that can come from majoring in psychology? And what are some common career paths that Binghamton students have chosen after leaving the program?
Sure. So, well, I've actually been in Binghamton for 20 years, so I actually, I know a lot of people, I know a lot of graduates over the years. So, and I'm thinking about what they do, and it depends on whether you go to graduate school or not. So psychology is something that we give you a very good broad foundation. Our students actually have pretty good success rate in getting into different graduate programs. I write a ton of letters of recommendation. And I always ask them to please tell me how it turned out. Sometimes you write the letter and then you don't know how it turned out. So I make sure that they always tell me. And actually, we have a lot of students that are very successful getting into graduate programs. So the common graduate programs, and then that launches their career. I would say we have a lot of people that do master's programs in, say, school psychology. So that would be working with in the schools to deal with the kind of issues that arise in an educational setting. So some of that's testing, some of that's more counseling, some of that's curriculum and things like that. We have at the master's level, that's a pretty common one. We have other people that go into master's levels counseling. More and more, you don't need to have a PhD in psychology to, in fact, they're putting PhD, insurance companies would probably rather reimburse at a cheaper level. Social workers, licensed independent social workers that can do counseling, and some of the master's level counseling. So you have that. We have people that go into what's called human factors, which just, every website that you visit probably has somebody who has used their knowledge of cognitive, people kind of complain about this, why we're all addicted to our phones, right? You've got some people that know a lot about human behavior that have designed that. So that's one of the fields I know people that have gone into. There are people that go into PhD programs in really every area of psychology, whether it's behavioral neuroscience, clinical psychology. So my graduate, I have 5 undergraduates that work in my lab, and 3 are graduating. And one is just going to try to get a job, and she's interested in human resources. And in the past, I've had students that have done well in that vein. I have one person that's going to get a PhD at Fordham in counseling psychology, and the last one is going to go into global health, get a master's of public health, and she was able to get into several programs with that. So it's a pretty flexible degree. You take courses on research methods and statistics, and that actually ends up training you pretty well. We have people that have gone into advertising and marketing, and it's having those research skills ends up, and writing skills and presentation skills ends up setting you up for some jobs at the bachelor's level, but it also sets you up for applying to grad school. And usually what you're going to do, what you're going to apply to graduate school for, it takes a little while to figure that out. You've got to take some courses to figure out what you're interested in.
Great, thank you. And so the next question we have is a kind of a personal question for you, but I'm interested too. So what's your favorite or most memorable study that you've ever taken part in? And are there any that stood out as being especially groundbreaking or famous or significant to you?
That I've taken part in, that I've actually researched myself?
Sure, yeah.
So I'm going to try to give you a quick explanation. So a lot of my research is actually on a topic that's called cognitive fluency or perceptual fluency. And so here's the basic idea. We can create illusions of recognition memory. Okay, so let me back up a second. So recognition memory is if you're walking down the street or across campus, you will see some people you know, you'll see strangers, and you always have this kind of decision, like, do you say hi to them? Do you ignore them? And you kind of, if you imagine that you usually have the goal of acknowledging people that you know and kind of not acknowledging the people that you don't know. And that's kind of a recognition memory situation. Or, you know, you might hear a song and you say, I recognize that song. So this idea is that is driven by a sense of familiarity. And so I always think, when I was trying to explain this recently to my parents, I said, which I've been in this field for literally 25 years and they still don't know what I do, but I said, you know, when you say, you use that expression that name rings a bell or that face rings a bell, I study that bell. Like, what is it that is happening at the moment that you feel like something is very familiar to you? And we know that it's very quick. It happens in less than a second. We know that it is basically intact. That ability is intact at the time of birth. Babies can recognize their mother's voices immediately. They can recognize songs immediately, and it doesn't decline much with age. There are other forms of memory that do decline as you get older, but recognition memory stays very stable. Okay, so that's what I study, and I have developed a paradigm where we can create illusions of memory simply by making things more perceptually easy, perceptually clear. And we can do that visually, but you can literally make things more clear or blurry on a screen. And things that are clearer, you tend to think that that you recognize them even when they're new. So if I just would make a bunch of faces blurry, they're all kind of blurry, but some are subtly less blurry than others. The less blurry ones, you think, oh, I think I've seen that person. I've seen that person. That person looks familiar to you. You can also create a sense of familiarity just by playing like music a little bit louder, you know, so that's just a type of clarity if you just make it easier to process. So we use ease of processing, how quickly and easily you can kind of understand or see something, is a kind of a proxy. It creates a sense of familiarity, and it creates a false sense of familiarity. So a lot of my research is actually on illusions. You can just really increase the number of false alarms on a test by just making things really familiar to people through perceptual means. So that's the kind of stuff I do. I test undergraduates in the lab. I manipulate how clear or blurry essentially the things are that they're tested on. And I just ask people, how have you seen this before? And you can really shoot up false alarm rates. I don't know if that's groundbreaking, but I think it's really cool. I think it's cool to try to understand, you know, we all have that weird feeling of familiarity we have around certain things. We're like, I feel like you know, it happens like when we're all watching a lot of Netflix right now. So you'll watch a TV show and you'll be like, that person looks so familiar to me. And it's this nagging sense that you want to resolve. And that's essentially what I study through a variety of means.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. If any of our students have any more questions that are related to curriculum or any of those. In fact, maybe you can talk a little bit about, you know, what the typical psychology student or major is going to look like, just kind of a simple pathway before they go in to choose those more specific courses, just what the foundational groundwork looks like and what the psychology major might look like.
Yep. So you come in, and usually the first semester you take our introductory to psychology course. It's called Psych 111. It's Psych 101. If you've already taken that, as a lot of people in high school, more and more, something like a third of our students these days have already taken something, and they have AP credit for that. And if your score is high enough, then you can skip that step. But we actually have fantastic professors that teach that course. We put some of our best professors there. So I you don't. Probably it's great if you want to retake it again or if you haven't taken it before. So that is our introductory course. And then usually after that, you take like an elective like developmental psychology or social psychology or personality or something like that. And then usually the following semester you take statistics, and that's just kind of ends up being a foundational course for a lot of our lab courses and our what we call our experimental courses. So you take statistics. I actually teach that. That's one of my, we have several faculty that teach it, but that's kind of my, that and human memory are my standard courses. And you take statistics. Sometimes people worry about taking statistics. We have great professors. I mean, it's everybody's trying to get into our statistics course, even in other majors, because we do a pretty good job at teaching it in a really clear, understandable way. And it's a fantastic course that every human should have, I believe, to understand. I mean, it's always very useful to understand any research from any field. And then at that same time, you have this cluster of courses, and it's sort of like a menu. Like you have to pick, I think, 3 courses from among like foundational topics, and you can kind of really tailor. This is a good time to tailor it based on your interests. So we have courses like cognition, perception, and learning, if you're interested in that kind of thing, behavioral neuroscience, if you're interested in that kind of thing. But if you're interested in more clinical counseling work, we have models and methods of psychotherapy fills that requirement. We have tests and measurements, and that is good if you want to go into any kind of graduate program that involves assessment. School psychology would be one of them. You could take that course to fulfill that. And I feel like I'm forgetting one, but anyway, those are like the 300 level courses you take usually with stats, and then usually you've got other general education courses to take here and there. So you're doing that stuff. And then you take a course called research methods. So essentially there are 3 required courses that every single psychology major takes, which is intro, stats, and research methods. And then after that, you have a lot of choices. You take research methods, usually your junior year, I'd say, and then your senior year, you're taking largely, you're just finishing labs. So you take 1 lab course. You can take more if you want, but 1 actual lab, 4-credit lab course and we offer them on perception, learning, psychotherapy lab, actually, behavioral neuroscience, cognition. And then I forgot to mention my memory class is one of those like 300 level experimental courses. And then your senior year, you're largely taking seminars, which are smaller courses on very focused topics. So we have some that are on the books for the fall, like neurotrauma, fetal alcohol syndrome, forensic psychology, witnessing a crime. We just have one about the psychology of witnessing a crime. We have variables that influence jurors. We have seminars on like AI, just trying to model cognitive processes. So it's really varied, and I'm planning one on autobiographical memory, specifically just that. So that's what you would do also. And then often you end up working in a lab if you have that interest. You're not required to, but if you want to work with a faculty member more closely, I think that's one of the great things about Binghamton. I went to a small liberal arts college, and we did not have the opportunity to work in a research lab. I would have loved it. It would, I somehow managed to get into grad school and all that stuff without that, but it would have been a wonderful opportunity. And I think that's one of the great things about this university is that we really do have undergraduates involved in the research process, along the way. So.
Thank you. And then maybe let's finish with this and then one more question. So what is the hardest part about the work that you do, would you say?
Yeah, it's the fact that you put so much work into so at the research level, 1 out of 5 of your experiments works. You have to get used to a lot of disappointing results. Mother Nature has plans, so you can kind of create an experiment, you can have solid hypotheses, but it just doesn't work out. A lot of our results are null results, so things don't have an impact. You think it should, and it doesn't. And a lot of the really obvious things have been done. My field is 135 years old, and it's a lot of smart people have been doing research on it that whole time. And so you're always trying to kind of think of something that's that's going to move the ball down the field, that's going to advance our knowledge of a topic. And it's hard to come up with those ideas, to be honest. And then you collect the data. It's always hard to figure out how you're going to implement your idea. And then it doesn't work. And so that is part of the process, and that you just have to really get used to it, almost expect that. And that is why it is so important that you enjoy the research process, because the outcome itself, you can toil away for a long time, and just your results are ultimately, they don't work out in a way that's sensible or interesting often. So I would say that. The other part of my job is, of course, teaching. And I would say, right now, this is it's very difficult to see our students having to, having to deal with this. So I've had a lot of conversations with other faculty members, and it's, we become very close with our students. So I think this is hard on everybody, but this has been the hardest. Part of it is trying to help students and kind of, at this point, helping them continue to learn even whenever there's so many distractions. So that's what I would say.
Great. And then, so our final question here is just what would you say sets Binghamton apart and kind of makes that psychology department different? I know we've mentioned the undergraduate research, and you've got some great advisors as well, but what's made you stay here for 20 years? And what do you think is different about our Binghamton students that you could maybe send home with some of these students as they're thinking about things?
Our students are really great. Well, one thing is that our students are really happy here. I felt like when I was in college, we would all get out of classes and I was happy with my college, but we would get out of classes and we just kind of complain about things. And maybe that was just the age, but I really like that the students tend to be quite happy here, and that's really nice to be around. I mean, we don't have very many students transfer out. We don't have that many students that leave. We have a really good retention level, and I think that there is something about being around people that are really happy to be there that just feeds you and sustains you. So I think that is my favorite thing. I mean, our students are so bright. You can teach at a really high level and they get it. We have no trouble recruiting faculty. So, it's always competitive to get good faculty members here, and we rave about the undergraduate students. I had a year where I did not have any graduate students. Like I had 3 that graduated and I didn't have any coming in. And so I just ran my lab just with undergraduate students, and they did fine. I mean, they were doing stuff that the graduate students were doing essentially. So I think just the other students are smart, and I think anybody, I don't know if anybody on there has played a sport, but I played tennis in high school, and I would notice that when I would play with people that were better than me, I would play better. And when I play with people that were not as good, I would be terrible, or just be lower. And I do think that there's just kind of there's a rigor at our university that everybody levels up a bit. And people are happy to be here. And then in particular, the psych department, it just does a good level. We're not such a big research institution that you don't see your professors. There are some places that are really strong on research as well, but a lot of those courses are taught by graduate students effectively. And so you don't really get to know the faculty. I feel like we're a good middle road.
Thank you so much, Deanne. So I think that's where we'll end. I think those were some great ending remarks. We thank everyone who's joined us today and stayed the whole time. This has been a really great, very interesting topic, and I've certainly learned more about the research program as well. So I just want to thank you again, Deanne. This was really wonderful, and thanks again to all of our students. If you did miss bits, we will have it on again to watch on our admissions website. So for any of students who did miss it, we'd welcome you to just watch it back. And we just wanted to thank Deanne again for your time and for coming on. This has been really great.
Sure. So I hope to meet some of you in the fall. If you saw me on this webinar, please come up and introduce yourself. And, it's always so strange to kind of talk to but I know you're out there. So please come in and say hi. So.
And Deanne, what did you say your email was again?
Okay, so my last name is Westerman, but when I started here, it was going to truncate it at Westerma. So I was like, I don't want that. So it's Wester, WESTER at Binghamton.
Okay, great. So I've just sent that to all of our students on the chat function. So if you want to email Deanne with more questions that you have about psychology in general, about our program at Binghamton, or about what she does or the topic, you can feel free to email her there.
Yep.
And we thank everyone who's just been on. It's been really great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for hosting.
So I hope everyone has a great weekend, and Stay safe.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.